And being Austrian, I can only tell you that the Tracht or the Dirndl is very important in our culture. We wear it as little children. It accompanies us throughout our lives and we wear them to several occasions. There's already a hint for the development of this Dirndl called Schuetzenliesl. This is something very Austrian. I don't know how many people now understood me. And he created that sign and he drew that waitress who would later be known as the Schuetzenliesl in a Dirndl, and it caused a lot of controversy, but her thinking behind was not freeing the woman. It was clearly creating a uniform that didn't allow anybody to be too unique or individualistic, because of course this is an anti-democratic move. Hi, my name is Liz. I'm a fashion and art historian and the founder of the fashion label Pelagona, and on this channel I'm telling you the stories behind fashion trends. As you may see, September is Trachten-time, it's Dirndl-time, it's the time of the Oktoberfest in Munich. This may be the reason why you know this garment. Another reason may be the Sound of Music movie about Salzburg in Austria. And being Austrian, I can only tell you that the Tracht or the Dirndl is very important in our culture. We wear it as little children. It accompanies us throughout our lives and we wear them to several occasions. Today I would like to explore with you what is the Dirndl actually, what is Tracht, where does it come from, how did it develop over time, and I would also like to discuss the political meaning of this dress or how it was often used as a political tool, and it also comes with kind of a problematic dimension to it. What I would like to say is that there is no one Dirndl that is worn all across the German-speaking regions. Every region, very often every valley or every village might have a different style of Dirndl. From the details you can often tell where these traditional Dirndls come from. For this reason, I would like to focus on the Austrian Dirndl. I will do a small excursion to Bavaria because of its influence on the Austrian Dirndl, but I would like to say this is just one dimension of the many Trachten or Dirndls that are out there. And one thing I would like to mention here is that even though the Dirndl has become such an important part of our culture and also fashion history, it is a bit tricky to research the Dirndl within the topic of the Tracht because there are quite a few blanks in the research. This stems from the fact that many ethnological researchers didn't really consider the Dirndl part of the Tracht. It is sometimes a bit challenging to find the information, but I found some very interesting and useful publications, which I'm also sharing in the description below or in my article on thepinklookbook.com if you want to learn more. Before we discuss the Dirndl, let me define the term Tracht. Tracht comes from the German verb tragen, which means to wear, and it referred to basically anything that was worn, garments, accessories, jewelry. And it was used for the festive wear that was very different from the everyday clothes. Today, when we use the term Tracht, we usually refer to the traditional costumes in the German-speaking regions in the areas of Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. So what is the Dirndl? The Dirndl is a dress, as you can see. It comes with a top, with a corsage, and the skirt is sewn onto it. We wear an apron with it and a blouse, and all of these parts and fabrics and embroidery and print, they can vary. I wear a white blouse underneath. There are many different interpretations. There are modern interpretations with laces, for example. Then you can see here my corsage is made of velvet. The Dirndl can also be made of linen, of cotton, and it usually reflects the region where it came from. Sometimes it reflects the social status, sometimes it reflects the religion. This is mostly in former times. So what you can see is that the traditional version of the Dirndl, not the ones that are produced by retailers abroad and imported here, they come with codes. And you can tell a lot from a Dirndl. And it is also a really respected craft if you can sew a Dirndl. It's not easy to sew it. And what I would like to encourage you to do if you want to buy a Dirndl, please go for one that's very authentic or that appreciates the heritage, because it's really a very special item that you will have for a very long time. Coming back to the corsage, it actually goes back to the 17th century and shaped the female silhouette until the 20th century. It is very tight. Even me talking now to you, I can feel the dress, because it is the certain silhouette that you want to achieve. And this also led to the fact that during the women's liberation movement, women freed themselves from the corsages, and this led even to the abandonment of the bra during the 1970s by the feminists. There's a certain dogma among people who want to preserve the original Dirndl, who say that Tracht can never be fashion, but I agree with Gexi Toastman, who said that Tracht is also fashion, that the two basically influence each other. There is a certain rivalry between the Tracht and the Dirndl. Some people say the Dirndl can't be Tracht, but the Dirndl actually evolved out of the Tracht, as I mentioned. We will later see that the Dirndl is basically a fashionable movement within the Trachten world. And the Tracht, the Dirndl and the fashion go together. They reflect the economical development, the developments within society, and also fashion trends. So we can't really separate them. And what is so interesting about the Tracht and the Dirndl is that they reflect the power of the people from the cities in the past, because these people, on the one hand, they looked down upon people who lived and worked in the countryside. They were the farmers, they were the elites who had better education, but then they went to the countryside, enjoyed it, they were inspired by the clothing of these farmers and took the nostalgia back to the city and then turned it into a fashion trend. So I find this juxtaposition very interesting. And Austria is one of the few countries where some so-called Trachten-Inseln, some Trachten Islands are still there. These are areas where the original type of the Tracht has been preserved. Some areas would be in the west, the Bregenzer Wald or the Montafon. The interest in the Trachten garments was fueled in the 19th century when there was a certain nationalist movement, the Heimatbewegung, which was against the oppression of an absolute state and against aristocracy. So there was some kind of nostalgia and focused on anything regional and local. There was a very romantic view of the countryside. The citoyens came and spent their summer holidays in the countryside. They saw the people, the local people, what they wore, and they were inspired by these clothes. And this is something very new that came about that hadn't existed before. They were inspired by the clothes of the people in the countryside and then turned them into fashion trends in the city. Of course, they made their garments from higher quality and more expensive materials. And there's already a hint for the development of this Dirndl called Kiedel, Schuetzenliesl. This is something very Austrian. I don't know how many people now understood me. Kiedel means skirt, Schürzen means apron, and Liesl is blouse. And this already hints at what the Dirndl looks like. And another important milestone in the development of the Trachten was the frock of Archduke John I, which later became the famous Trachten suit. The Industrial Revolution had an enormous impact on the life of the people in the Austro-Hungarian Empire as well, because the farming society collapsed and this changed the daily lives of basically everyone. And it also had an impact on fashion, because fashion became more democratized. Usually fashion was something for the elites in the cities, but also slowly, due to the Industrial Revolution, it trickled down to the countryside. So suddenly the small shop in a village had certain printed materials. The people had access to fabrics that were not as heavy anymore, for example cotton, and they also didn't have to sew everything themselves, because previously everything was self-made and suddenly you could buy socks, you could buy blouses, so there was no necessity anymore to sew it themselves. This also impacted the elites in the cities in a way, because the more this democratization also reached the countryside, the more this nostalgia tended to disappear. And the Viennese artist Adolf Loos even said, it is a bit cynical, but he said that maybe the elites from the city don't want to give up the nostalgia. They don't want to see the farmers in these modern clothes, because it is basically that they have to give up their status. They are not superior to the farmers anymore. And this nostalgia led to the creation of Trachtenvereine. These are Trachten associations. They aimed at preserving the original Tracht. These Trachtenvereine were in Austria, Bavaria, but also in Switzerland. And up until the First World War, Bavaria had a very strong influence on the Austrian Tracht. For example, the Lederhosen, also the tumbled jacket and the linen jacket, three pieces that are so important now in the western regions of Austria for the Tracht, they were actually imported from Bavaria by Leopold Brandauer. After 1870, when all of these clubs and associations were formed to protect this original Tracht, there is a movement already in development which will become very problematic later, because it's the idea of the healthy people, das gesunde Volk, and also the idea of the nation. Anything national was not tied anymore to the landscape, to the traditions, it was tied to the race. And we see that already long before the Nazis, these problematic ideas were also tied to the local traditions and also the Tracht. And coming back to the Industrial Revolution, it not only democratized the fashion, as I said before, it also made it easier to wear this fashion. You have to imagine in former times it was like on a wedding day, you needed somebody to help you to wear certain outfits or garments, and with the Industrial Revolution this became much easier, and soon at the turn of the century there were also cut patterns, so it became much easier to recreate the outfits and they were much easier to wear. As I mentioned before, the elites of Austria went to the countryside to spend their summer holidays, and this also continued at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, and up until today there's a certain nostalgia about this so-called Sommerfrische, about these summer holidays. They brought this nostalgia back to the cities. They were inspired by the clothes, and then of course they recreated the garments with more expensive and higher quality materials. But what is interesting is that the fashion trend then was also picked up by the people in the countryside. They imitated the people from the city and kind of took back their garments into the countryside, but the difference was now that the materials were more lightweight, the garments were not that cumbersome anymore as before. So I come back to the argument by Gexi Toastman before about fashion and Tracht. I do think that they go together, and this already shows this development, how closely the economic development and fashion trends are connected and reflected in the Tracht and the Dirndl as well. And as another proof, there's also a quote by the Wiener Frontzeitung in 1912 where they say that you won't see the same woman wearing the same Dirndl the next year when she goes on summer holidays. So we can also assume that the Dirndl was affected by these fashion trends. Let's quickly travel to Bavaria, because I mentioned before that Bavaria had a very strong influence on the Austrian Tracht as well. In 1881, the artist August von Kaulbach was asked to create an advertisement, a sign for a brewery to promote their beer, and he was inspired by a young waitress, and he created that sign and he drew that waitress, who would later be known as the Schuetzenliesl, in a Dirndl, and it caused a lot of controversy because for the time her neckline was very low. And the silhouette was also very feminine, and of course it achieved what they wanted to do with it, because men, the target group, talked about it, they bought the beer, and up until today this Schuetzenliesl influenced this movement around the Biermadeln in Bavaria, which are still the servers, if you think of the Oktoberfest, in the Dirndl. I personally find the story of the brothers Wallach very interesting. They were Jews from the Rhineland, and they founded a Trachten store in Munich. They heavily shaped the development of the Dirndl. They sourced fabrics, they printed their own fabrics, they supplied the aristocracy, the elites with their designs, and they were even a Hoflieferant, which means they were an official supplier of the king. When we think along history, you can already assume what happened to their business. In 1938, the business was Aryanized. You can imagine that the Nazis didn't really like to see Jews run a Trachten business. Tracht was then instrumentalized by the Nazis for the German race and definitely not for the Jews. So the family then went into exile in America. They managed to get their assets back after 1945, and they were operating that business until the 1980s, when they sold their business to the famous Trachten retailer Lodenfrei. Another Bavarian I would like to mention here is Julien. She traveled from Franconia across the German-speaking regions in 1912, and she documented the Tracht in a lot of detail. It's actually surprising that her publication has not been used or referenced more. And this leads me to another woman back in Austria. Gertrud Pesendorfer was from Innsbruck, and she published a book about the Trachten in 1938. She was the official commissioner of the Reich to look after all the matters of the Trachten. Gertrud Pesendorfer grew up as the daughter of a businessman, and it can be assumed that she saw all the tourists from America, the British, the Jews, coming to Innsbruck and then wearing the Dirndl, and obviously she didn't like it because she started, or she was one of the founders of this idea that the Tracht should be something for the German race. So her mission was to create Tracht, or a Dirndl, that unified the German race, and the Dirndl should be simpler than the traditional Dirndl. So she also said she freed the women from the cumbersome clothes. but her thinking behind was not freeing the woman. It was clearly creating a uniform that didn't allow anybody to be too unique or individualistic, because of course this is an anti-democratic move. Pesendorfer's Dirndl referenced the Leibkittel from the Salzkammergut region in Upper Austria, and the problematic thing about Pesendorfer is not only that she was part of the regime, that she shaped the movement, that she created that uniform. The problem is that decades after the war, her publication was used as a blueprint for the creation of further dirndls, and a lot of people either ignored that fact or didn't really question her. And as I mentioned before, what many people forget, it didn't only start with the Nazis in 1938. This movement already came about long before that. You can see that Tracht and political ideology were also closely connected. And of course, during the Austro-fascism from 1934 to 1938, and then during the Nazis, the Dirndl or the Tracht became a tool for their ideology and a political instrument. And another event I would like to mention, because it heavily promoted the Trachten, was the Salzburger Festspiele, the annual classical music festival. And many of the well-to-do visitors, the actors, the musicians, they wore the Tracht, and until today it is very fashionable to attend this classical music festival in the Tracht. A general thing I would like to mention here is that in former times it was not normal like today to have a big variety of clothes. Most people could not afford many garments and they just made do. So they had garments that they altered, that they repaired. The colors and materials were chosen in a way so that when it was dirty, you could not really tell that it was dirty. You had a clear separation between the everyday clothes for the work in the household or on the farm, and the special clothes for the Sundays, for the special holidays. So basically it was festive wear. And I still remember my grandmother saying Sonntagwand, Sonntagskleidung, the Sunday clothes, that there was this obvious difference between what you wore for a special day and what you wore during the weekend for work. Since the 1950s, many regions have come up with new interpretations of the Tracht, or they created artificial Trachten, which means that they didn't have a Tracht before and then just created it to also have one. I also think that there's an overall trend for Trachten due to the Oktoberfest, because it's such a big global festival now. So many people come to Munich to party and they want to wear the Dirndl. It also led to many copies of the Oktoberfest, and also it has become kind of trendy again to go to these beer festivals, or Zeltfeste as we call it. And this also led to a development that people often don't know anymore what the Dirndl is really about. They buy generic Dirndls with no meaning that are very often also produced under questionable circumstances. Unfortunately, the Tracht and the Dirndl keep being instrumentalized by the far right. There are Trachten days, Dirndlgewand days. It may be interpreted as a political statement if you wear the Dirndl, so this is kind of an unfortunate development. But we can also see a positive development, because this overall popularity of the Tracht and the Dirndl has led to new designs and also labels who refocus on the Dirndl or who still produce the Dirndl. For example, Lola Paltinger has really nice designs. She is based in Munich. Also Susanne Spatt, or for example, I personally really like the designs by Gexi Toastman, who also published a book about the Trachten and who is considered an expert in the field. And there are also innovative labels that come up with kind of hybrid approaches for the Dirndl. For example, None from Munich, they use the traditional Dirndl silhouette and make it out of African fabrics, and I really like this merging of cultures. And this actually reminds me that I once had a Dirndl made in Beijing out of Chinese fabric, so maybe this is something I should revisit. In any case, I'm curious, do you own a Dirndl, or how have you learned about the Dirndl? Are there any questions that you would like to ask me? Let me know in the comments below. I have also written an article on the pinklookbook.com, and you can also find the sources in the description of this video. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Thank you very much for watching. Servus and goodbye.